Welcome to the Liberty Reporter edition of the legislative wrap-up for the 2021 legislative session. I'm Jason Stevenson, being joined by Marina Lowe, the ACLU of Utah's Legislative and Policy Council. We're going to quickly move through some of the big items and important trends that happened during the legislative session. But quick, let me just give you a recap of what the ACLU did. We were very active during this last legislative session. We reviewed more than 150 bills. We ultimately worked and tracked on about 110 of them, either by amending or testifying or otherwise being involved on 67 of those bills. We published 85 social media alerts, letting our followers and those that work with us to let us know what we thought was important, what they should act on. And we created over 14 videos during the 45-day session that attracted over 6,000 views. We hope you saw some of those videos, and we hope you enjoy this video as we get into recapping the 2021 legislative session. Thanks, Marina, for being here. Appreciate your time.
Sure, happy to be here.
I wanted to check in about one of the major trends that you saw during this session. What made it a little bit different, besides the big obvious thing that we are dealing with the pandemic? But on issues and policy, what was different this year?
I do want to just touch briefly on COVID, though, because I think it obviously sort of permeated every aspect of all of our lives this year, and certainly the legislative session is no different. The things that I just want to touch on briefly is that I think it really expanded participation in some ways. People were able to participate in the legislative session and give testimony and weigh in on bills, regardless of where they live. And I think we're going to see that continue in the future. I don't think that's limited just to COVID. I think that sets the stage for, easier access via Zoom and other technology in the future. And I think that's a good change and something that we'll see in the years to come. And so I think that's really a positive, the silver lining of COVID this year. In terms of substantive issues, I think that like so many other states this year, there was a lot of discussion around police reform, and Utah was not exempt from that. We had a number of bills touching on this subject. Questions related to law enforcement discipline, aspects dealing with use of force and the types of techniques and tactics that law enforcement can use. And then conversely, we also saw, and I think this is true in other states as well, some legislation really getting at the flip side of the coin, so to speak, from what we saw over the summer, and really looking at this question about protests and when do protests sort of tip into this place of riot, where we do see behavior that is arguably more problematic. And so I think those were major conversations that were happening at the Utah State Legislature this year, and they're major conversations that are happening in our country more broadly.
It's true that we were sort of a pinpoint of a lot of other discussions that are happening in other state legislatures. One big issue where that happened was on anti-transgender legislation. We saw two bills come up this year. One of them newish, one of them kind of we'd seen before, that would have severely limited the rights, especially of transgender youth in our state. Somehow, Utah managed to defeat those bills. Advocates, lobbyists, medical professionals. You were very involved in this issue. Can you tell us how Utah ended up sending these bills back to wherever they came from instead of passing them into laws, which other states might do or even have done in the case of Arkansas?
Yeah, so there were two bills. One deals with limiting the ability of transgender youth to have access to medical services, and the second has to do with limiting transgender girls' access to participate in sports. As you mentioned, Jason, both of these bills were being floated in lots of other states, not just in Utah, and we were successful in pushing back against both of these bills. And I think there are a couple of reasons for that. We have a really strong coalition of voices that were elevated, that really got the message out both to lawmakers, to the governor's office, to other policymakers in the state. And this is, kids, parents, doctors, universities, sports organizations. The NCAA actually just came out with a very strong statement 2 days ago, I believe, basically directing that their events should not be held in places where there are discriminatory laws in place. And so I think that's a really strong signal coming from these organizations about the economic impact that can flow from these negative types of bills. But, thinking about what sets Utah apart, I think we sort of have a long history in this state of trying to figure out ways to deal with policy in the LGBT realm in a collaborative way. And I think that it really resonated with lawmakers and others, this feeling that transgender individuals weren't part of the conversation, weren't being consulted, weren't sort of having a discussion about how we could perhaps grapple with these issues if they need to be grappled with in a way that brings everybody to the table and really thinks about positive solutions. I don't think this issue is going to go away. I think we will see this in years to come. But who knows? I mean, we had a Republican senator, when the sports bill in particular was being debated, point out, is this just the latest trend? Is this the newest version of the bathroom bills that seemed to sort of dominate conversation a few years ago and then just sort of disappeared? Nobody's really talking about the bathroom issue anymore. So I think it remains to be seen. We will continue to partner with our allies at Equality Utah and others to make sure that that we are keeping an eye out for these bills and to think about ways to defeat them in the future.
And one interesting thing to tag on to that is that Utah has an NBA basketball team, the Utah Jazz. We have national championships with the NCAA, the All-Star game for the NBA, all slated to come to Utah. And there was a lot to lose by pursuing those bills. Some of these other states didn't quite have as much in the game there. And so in some sense,
even the Olympics.
Yeah, of course, the big one, international, right? So Utah has a lot more to lose because we're such a prominent player, especially in the sports stage. So that was an interesting dynamic to watch happen. One more question I wanted to get to was, looking ahead, what do you think will be the most significant bill that came out of the 2021 session, the one that will have the most impact down the line, especially one that we worked on?
Yeah, so I think it would probably be a piece of legislation run by Representative Gibson that deals with privacy and sort of this intersection between privacy and technology. This bill comes out of sort of a long history of the ACLU and other organizations working to push back against the ever sort of advancing and rapidly advancing development of technology, and technology that really sort of invades our privacy in really insidious ways. So we have worked on legislation sort of individually trying to target these new technologies. What this bill does is, I think, sort of takes a more proactive stance. It puts together a commission of individuals who will be tasked with thinking about the ways in which Utah's privacy could be violated by emerging technologies, and sort of ask this commission to assess these new technologies and sort of give a green light or a red light to lawmakers and other policymakers before they decide to either contract with technology companies or otherwise make use of these types of technologies. And the reason why I think this is so important is that it really puts together a framework for studying these issues moving forward. And my hope is that in the future, it will sort of become matter of course that before legislation can even be introduced in these areas, or before contracts can be entered into by the government, that they will have to demonstrate that they've already brought these issues to this commission for study. And so I think this really does have incredible impact moving forward for Utahns, really to make sure that our privacy rights are being considered in the future.
Got it. Long-term impact. It seems as if it's like a technocratic review board, which doesn't exist right now, but could really help prevent some of the missteps that we've seen state government make on contracts and kind of the smoke and mirrors that vendors are throwing at them. So that sounds like a great bill, something to watch out for, and a big success, because I know you worked on that bill this year.
Yeah.
One question.
Definitely one we're happy to see.
Oh, great. One question I wanted to cover as well was, Marina, you work with so many people on the Hill. Every time we talk to you during the session, you're like, I just got out of a meeting with this person and that person. And your Rolodex must be about the size of one of those old supercomputers from the 80s. Who do you work with? What do you value in terms of being able to walk into a room and being able to know everyone there? Is that something that makes our affiliate a little bit unique, do you think?
I think relationships are the key of a successful lobbying program. There's no doubt about that. And one of the things that I think is wonderful about working at the ACLU is that we work with everyone. There's literally nobody that I can think of that we've never worked with. So, we sometimes find ourselves testifying in support of bills alongside the Eagle Forum, for example. That often catches lawmakers and the public at large by surprise, but oftentimes we do have views that might intersect, for example, when it comes to issues around technology and privacy. That's a place where we align. There are lots of sort of familiar partners you would expect for us to get along with. We work regularly with Equality Utah and Planned Parenthood and Alliance for a Better Utah and groups like that. But we also work with Libertas on a lot of criminal justice reform issues. We work with Americans for Prosperity, another group that typically falls on the other side of the aisle from groups like the ACLU. We work with folks like the Retailers Association. They had a lot of concerns about a couple of the bills that we saw moving forward this year that had to do with the intersection of technology and First Amendment rights. We work closely sometimes, oftentimes with criminal defense lawyers, but we also work with prosecutors and with law enforcement. The courts, groups like the NAACP, Black Lives Matter, you name it. If there's a group on Capitol Hill, we've probably worked with them on an issue or two.
And the key is not to burn bridges. You can oppose one person's bill, but then be sitting next to them and testifying together the next hearing the next day. So it's right. An interesting dance that happens. One final question, I promise this is my last one, and that is there any bills that failed this year, that didn't make it through the legislature, that you look forward to working on in coming years? We know sometimes it takes a couple of swings to get a bill to become a law. Are there any bills that stand out this year that you hope come back?
Yeah, absolutely. There are two sort of police reform bills that are really more major, substantial reforms that we saw take place in other states that failed here in Utah. And I think these are worthy of taking another stab at. One of these has to do with no-knock warrants, further limiting the ability of law enforcement to use these types of tactics when investigating crime. We've seen some of the really terrible ramifications of these types of methods in other places like Louisiana, for example. And so I think this is a worthy place for us to dig in. And the other is qualified immunity. We increasingly are seeing states step up to limit the ability for qualified immunity statutes to make it difficult in the event of officer-involved incidents. And so, we saw Colorado leading out on this. New Mexico just recently followed as well. And so I think Utah is in a good spot to also consider that type of major reform.
Got it. All right. We'll look forward to hearing more about those bills in the coming sessions. Thank you for taking the time to walk us through the one that just ended. We hope you took a well-deserved break, but we know you're going to be right back into working on legislation for 2022. Thank you again, Marina Lowe, for being with us.
Thanks for having me.